My name is Chris Shelton. I am a former Scientologist, and I was invited to come and speak at Paganicon because I have some experience with groups that maybe aren't so great. And I have spent the last 4 to 5 years learning about what makes a group not so great, or what we call a destructive cult. And we'll go over what that means precisely and you know, what I'm talking about when I start throwing the word cult around, because I know that's a very loaded word, and it gets thrown around probably too liberally in, you know, in various groups. Let's see here. Oh, yeah. How many folks here know anything about Scientology? Okay, you've heard of it, know a little bit about it. Maybe saw Leah's show or the Going Clear documentary or something like that. Okay. Or South Park. Perfect. Perfect. Okay, good. All right. Well, the purpose of my talk is not to do a Scientology 101 necessarily, because that's not really what this is about, but I am going to talk about my history in Scientology and some basic things about it. So you'll get a little bit of an overview. Now, this is something I've been talking about for a long time, and I've done a lot of videos and stuff about it. And I could talk about this for hours. It is a fascinating subject that a lot of people have a lot of questions about. Rather than do an interactive sort of talk at the beginning here where you just throw questions at me, though, I think that the main points of what I want to cover might get derailed if we just talk about that. So what I want to do is I want to do the sort of outline that I've put together here, and then we'll do a Q&A section at the end, okay? Cool. All right. Scientology. Okay, so I grew up in Scientology. I joined when I was about 4 years old because I was a very precocious and ambitious little kid. Not really. I really had no choice in the matter at all. My parents got involved. And I just grew up with it just like anybody else grows up in any other kind of religious household. I didn't really think about it too much. It wasn't something I was consulted with or anything like that. My parents just did it. And then there's a lot of language in Scientology, a lot of ideas, you know, some philosophical concepts about spirituality and our true nature and that kind of thing. And I just kind of grew up thinking that was how the world was. Just like anybody who would grow up in a Christian or a Catholic household would think that that's how the world was. I didn't get too much ribbing about it in school until I hit high school, but that was also the time when I started becoming more involved with it on a one-on-one basis. And that is, well, I think there might be some lessons there. Like, for example, when I was 15 years old, my dad said, "Why don't you go down to the local church and just see what it is for yourself?" And I was like, okay. So I went down. I was in California at the time. I lived in Santa Barbara, or near Santa Barbara, so I went to the Santa Barbara church, and I did the personality test that they offer, which is 200 questions all about, you know, yes, no, maybe, on a bunch of weird questions like, do I browse railway timetables for fun? And, you know, do I often feel depressed for no reason? And these kinds of, you know, sort of vague, generalized kind of questions. And what the result of this was supposed to be a scientific graph of my personality. You know, how happy or sad I was, how in communication or withdrawn I was, how responsible or capricious I was. These were all plotted on a graph. And really what this did is it enabled somebody who worked at the organization there to sit down with me and do what I now would call a sort of a warm reading. It gives you some information about the person, and then they start asking questions and seeing what hits. And what hit for me, and what hit for a lot of people who get involved in Scientology, is communication. I felt like, well, I was 15 years old. I was in high school. I couldn't get a date. I couldn't talk to girls. I was very kind of shy, geeky, nerdy kind of guy. And so here's this woman telling me, oh, you're shy, you're introverted, you have a hard time talking to girls. Like, this is a big, momentous discovery for me that she's telling me this, whereas pretty much she was describing every 15-year-old high schooler, right? So that was kind of my introduction to it, but I just about fell out of my chair with how accurate this was, and I couldn't sign up fast enough for their communications class. And the communications class basically taught me how to look people in the eye when I'm talking to them and project myself in such a way that I can be heard. And so I thought, wow, this was awesome, this was amazing. And I proceeded to continue to not get any dates and not meet girls. But hey, Scientology was wonderful and it really worked. And I really did think that. And I had a lot of vested interests and reasons to think that because my parents, again, were involved. They had actually been going all the way up to the top of Scientology's, what they call the bridge to total freedom. It's a series of steps that you do in order to attain what is considered total spiritual freedom and personal immortality. It's a great idea. And if Scientology was able to deliver on that promise, I wouldn't be standing here talking about it right now. I'd still be doing it. But it doesn't really deliver that. And in fact, it delivers things that are a lot worse than that, which we'll talk about. Though, when I was 15, 16, 17, I finished high school, and I was going to go be a writer. I was going to go to college. I kind of had a path for my life, sort of worked out, kind of a la be Stephen King, because I really, admired him, and I loved writing, and I thought fiction writing would be a great thing to do. Well, they sat me down one day and they said, no, what you should really do is you should save the world. And you should be doing that by joining up with us. And I thought, okay, sure. And there was a lot of, at that time, it took a few days because my parents actually, while they were full in and totally true believers in Scientology, they weren't so keen on me working for the church. They had worked for the church, and they didn't have a great experience at it. And so they were kind of like, yeah, you don't really know what you're getting into. And in order to work for the Church of Scientology, I would have to sign a voluntary contract of commitment for 5 years. And my dad was like, you don't know what it's like to do anything for 5 years. You haven't done anything, and right? That was a little surprising. I'd never really duked it out with my parents over much of anything. We had a really great relationship, and this was a little surprising to me, but I resisted. And I kept getting, I guess the best way to describe it is I was getting love bombed by the people at the church. They were constantly feeding me with how great I was, how smart I was, what a wonderful addition to the group I would be. And this was coming from multiple people. One of them, this very good-looking blonde woman who I admired quite a bit, and so I thought, yeah, I want to be here. And that was kind of, how they convinced me to start working for the church. I guess one of the points I want to make along the way here, while I'm talking about how I got more and more deeply involved in this group, is that it was a small series of agreements along the way. I didn't dive in on day one, and for those of you who have seen South Park, no one was talking about Xenu or galactic overlords or space aliens, none of that. In fact, I didn't learn about that. I ended up being involved with this group for 27 years, and I never heard about Xenu or space aliens once the whole time, because I didn't make it to that level. Okay, so I signed up for the staff thing, and I started working for the church there, and it was kind of a rough go because they don't pay you, really. And so I had to have another job in order to keep myself going. What I found out after I signed up, not before, is that you don't have minimum wage when you work for the Church of Scientology. That 5-year contract of commitment includes, and if I'd read the fine print, I don't know that I still would have gotten it, but it includes the idea that you are a religious worker who's a volunteer. Oh, I'm a volunteer, okay. So the exchange that I would get from the organization for working for the church was that I would receive Scientology Services. They offer classes and personal counseling, or what they call auditing is the word for it in Scientology, that I would get for free if and when I had the time to do it, because I was working for the church. Then when I wasn't on my 40-hour shift of working, I was working nights and weekends at the church. I was working 40 hours a week at a full-time day job so that I could pay my rent, eat, and afford to show up there. So my life basically became this kind of work all the time. And I did that for a number of years. But I really felt that what I was doing was important to save the world. And I've since come to say that there's kind of nothing really more dangerous to the world at large than a young person who thinks they're saving it. Because I was dedicated, I was gung-ho, I was all in, and I was a true believer. I really thought that this stuff was gonna change things. So I didn't know to look for or see the red flags. And having been raised in it, I was even more not looking for the red flags that were there, but I only saw them later on. So I joined staff when I was 17, and for 8 years I worked in Santa Barbara. One of L. Ron Hubbard is the guy who came up with all of Dianetics and Scientology. He wrote all the books, he gave thousands of lectures, like probably about 5,000 or so over all the years that he was doing it. He started it in 1950 with Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health. Scientology itself started in 1952 or so. He went in on it with a science, Dianetics, the modern science of mental health. Well, that went bankrupt twice in 2 years. It was panned by the scientific community because there wasn't really anything scientific about it. You can call anything you want a science. It doesn't make it a science. So Scientology comes along as a religious philosophy. And it's not a religion in the sense that you worship. It's not a religion in the sense that there is communion and these various rituals and things like that, or masses or something like that. The way they describe it is that Scientology is an applied religious philosophy. And it's religious because it deals with man as a spiritual entity, not a body. The basic philosophy of Scientology is that you are not your body. You are a spiritual entity called a thetan, and from the Greek letter theta. And that spiritual entity that is you has existed for countless millennia into the past and will exist for countless millennia into the future. And you are trapped in an endless cycle of having a body, growing the body dies, you go to a hospital and you pick up another baby, and you cycle through another life, and another one, and another one. And you've been doing this for millions, billions, trillions of years. Since before the physical universe, this place even existed. And what Scientology offers as sort of the ultimate carrot of personal spiritual freedom and immortality is a break from that cycle, the ability to causatively and knowingly break free from that and be able to do anything you want. And that's, if you think about it, a pretty cool carrot. I mean, you kind of, if you go into that and you think that's how things really are, and you're trapped in this, so much so you can't even remember your past lives, then you'd give a lot to be able to break out of that. And through the course of Scientology auditing or counseling, you are taken back to, you recall times of past incidents of pain and stress and trauma, which L. Ron Hubbard says causes you to forget bad things that have happened to you in the past. In fact, it causes you to forget everything that happened to you in the past. So through the course of this counseling or auditing, you recall your past lives. You recall who you've been, where you've been, what you've been up to for all these years. and you then release, sort of the binds or the shackles that you've sort of put on yourself as a spiritual entity. So that's basically the philosophy of it. And like I said, if I still believed that, and if I thought that that actually resulted in something wonderful and great for people, then I'd still be doing it. But I've come to learn that that's not really the case. The other thing about Scientology, and this is kind of an important little point, is that you pay for that counseling. And you pay for the classes, and you pay for the books and the lectures. And you pay a lot. In order to get to the level that South Park talks about, where you have the Xenu and the Galactic Overlord and all that, you've coughed over, by that point, that's called OT level 3, or Operating Thetan level 3. There are 8 of those levels. You've paid about $250,000 to $500,000. And ultimately, to get all the way to the top, you're going to cough over, $1 million plus, generally speaking. It varies because some people give more than others, but there is a set series of donations. You have to pay a certain amount in order to get to that level. So that's kind of how it works. It's a pay-to-play religion. It's not free. It is not at all. Well, that's why it's not tax exempt in a lot of countries. That's right. Exactly. There's a public benefits test that countries outside the United States have to determine whether something receives religious status or not, and Scientology has never passed one public benefits test because it doesn't exist for public benefit. It exists to make money. In the end, that's really what it's all about. But when I was 25 years old and I was still knee-deep and neck-deep in this, Hubbard's policies and his guidelines for how to run the churches and the organizations called for individuals taking responsibility for the group and for applying his rules and guidelines and policies. And he said that the only reason that his organizations do not expand and get bigger and grow and bring more people in and Scientology should be taking over the world, that is their idea. And they're not even shy about it. They call it clearing the planet. Because if you clear someone, you get them to a place where they are free from all of that past stress and trauma. That's called the state of clear. And it's sort of a midway point before you get up to those OT levels and get onto that Xenu stuff. So Scientology's goal is to clear the planet. Get everybody into Scientology. A common mantra in Scientology or saying is, everyone's a Scientologist, they just don't know it yet. So they're very strongly convinced that they've got the one and only solution. And this is another little point. Scientology is not about find your own path. Scientology is about you follow these rules and these guidelines in this direction from L. Ron Hubbard, or you're doing it wrong. And it's our way or the highway. Now, at the lower levels, and when they talk to the general public, they'll say, we're multi-denominational. Anybody can be a Scientologist. You can be a Catholic and be a Scientologist, Christian Scientologist. Sure, for a little while. But as you start getting more and more of that auditing and moving on up that line to crossing that bridge to total freedom, you start finding Hubbard's lectures and the organization itself becoming less and less tolerant of you doing something other than Scientology for personal improvement or spiritual growth. Little thing. Okay. So he says that if the organization's not growing, if we're not expanding, if we're not successful, it's because you guys, us staff members, aren't following L. Ron Hubbard's policies to the letter. It's on you, right? And so I believe that. And so when I was 25 years old, I'd worked for 8 years at the Santa Barbara church. We were pretty much the same size as we were when I started. There were about 20 of us working there. And we worked pretty hard, and we tried to bring new people in, and we went out on the street selling books and, doing the various work that we did. And it wasn't really going, and I could see enough to see, well, this isn't really going anywhere. What am I doing with myself? So rather than apply a little bit of critical thinking and kind of look at maybe what else is in the world, I doubled down. And I joined what's called the Sea Organization. And that's S-E-A, the sea as in the ocean, the Sea Organization. This was a group that L. Ron Hubbard started in 1967 as the core, most dedicated, most hardcore Scientologists. And I went all in. I just totally doubled down on it, and I just went for it. I ended up moving to Los Angeles, and the Sea Organization is a 24/7 operation. You, as a Sea Org member, just work for the church. It's a paramilitary group. They uniform you. It's kind of like the Navy. There's ranks and ratings and saluting and yes sir, no sir. I mean, they really take themselves quite seriously, and I really did take myself quite seriously about this because we were on a mission. We had a job to do. We had to clear the planet. And at this point, after being in really pretty hard for 8 years, I had really gone all in on this. So I really thought that we were racing against time. If you turn on CNN or Fox News or any of the media, it's not hard to get the idea that the world's going to hell in a handbasket pretty fast. Now, I'm not saying that it is. I'm saying it's easy to get the idea that it is. And that was a viewpoint that was pushed and repeated and talked about over and over again in the church, amongst the staff and amongst the public. And we believed this and went for this because L. Ron Hubbard told us so over and over and over again in his books and his lectures. He said that this bad part of our mind and our spirit, which was called the reactive mind, was responsible for all the ills of the world. And clearing the planet meant getting rid of this reactive mind. We had a thing to do. We had to get rid of this reactive mind. If we did that, the world would be great. So that was the mission. And it involved getting everybody in and auditing them up to this level of clear. So like I said, I doubled down. I went into the Sea Org, and I was fed by the Sea Org. I was clothed by the Sea Org. They had birthing spaces, dormitory-style living. You know, have you ever seen those pictures of the big blue buildings in Los Angeles that have the big Scientology sign on them? Anybody ever seen that? That's where I worked. That's where I lived. That big blue building with the Scientology sign, that's where all the staff who live on that base, that's what they call it, a base, that's where they live. And then I'd get up in the morning, eat breakfast in the galley where they served us food, and I'd cross the street, and I would work in the basement of one of the buildings there. It was a blue building. And I just worked my guts out for another 17 years. Had a lot of adventures and misadventures and various things happening while I was there. And I kind of gradually saw, I mean, first I went all in, and I went in harder and harder and harder, and it was about 8 years in that I totally burned out, that I just hit a wall, and I took off for 3 days, and I kind of walked from Los Angeles, from Hollywood to Pasadena, where I'd grown up in Pasadena. And I kind of crashed in a hotel for 3 days, and I just sort of got some, and then I went back because I was still invested, one, in the belief system, and two, I had gotten married to another Sea Org member, so I had that vested interest in going back because I loved her, and I didn't want to just take off and leave her. And I still thought, even though I could see at this point, do you guys want to grab a seat? Okay, fine. And I thought that even though there were problems with the group, there were problems with how we were being managed, there were issues with too much pressure, you know, there was a lot of pressure. It's kind of like, have any of you guys ever worked for or seen like a high-intensity call center where you just kind of like, you know, you're on the phone and you just got to make that sale, and then that one, you know, maybe you make it, maybe you don't, and then you do another one and another one, another one, and there's guys walking around, pushing, let's go. That was what my life was like as a Sea Org member all the time. It's that level of intensity. Okay, so I went back and I went through some justice actions because I had taken off and without authorization I had gone AWOL. And I kind of went through that and went through what the atonement process that I had to go through, which took a long time, 3 years, no big. And then I kind of kept working, but I knew something was kind of off with the group. And basically what ended up happening that kind of got me out of that situation or starting to really look at leaving that situation was it started dawning on me through the experiences that I had going around. I started traveling from church to church to church, doing projects. I was being sent out away from Los Angeles and going out to Twin Cities, to Seattle, to Las Vegas. And we were at this point opening up new, refurbished or renovated churches of Scientology. And if you see Scientology in the news, that's probably what you're seeing is press releases or notices about how they bought a new building, renovated it, and opened it up to great fanfare. And look at how Scientology is expanding like crazy because they had to buy this new building and renovate it and open it with great fanfare. Well, what I saw was I'd go to these openings and there'd be, you know, a couple hundred people there for the opening, maybe if that, you know, however many. And the next day, nobody was there anymore. They all just came for the opening and then and they went back home, or they flew back to whatever town they had flown into town from to see the opening. And the church leader, David Miscavige, would fly into town, cut the ribbon. It was a great big thing. And then the next day, crickets. Nobody was particularly flooding into our churches, and it wasn't really taking off. And I saw this over and over and over again, but then I would see that same leader, David Miscavige, come out at periodic events for Scientologists and tell all the Scientologists how these empty churches were actually full and expanding, and more people were becoming Scientologists than ever before. And we never had millions of members. Total lie. Because I saw for myself, and I was seeing things that other Scientologists weren't necessarily seeing because I was traveling from one place to another to another. So it started dawning on me that I was being told one thing about the group and how it operates, but I was seeing something different. And at first, I tried to tell myself, like kind of anybody would, I think, well, there's reasons, there's justifications, there's excuses, and I tried to rationalize what I was seeing with my own eyes and try to make it make sense. But after about a year or two of this, of traveling around, and finally ending up here in Minnesota, at the church here, over in St. Paul, I opened up that place, 80,000 square feet, beautiful building, gorgeous. Well, we closed the street, opened it up. David Miscavige flies into town, right? Meet and greet, shaking hands, everything's great. We're gonna like blow this place away. He leaves the next day, 80,000 square feet of nothing. There's nothing happening there. Nobody's curious, nobody wants to come in, nobody wants anything to do with Scientology. And I couldn't figure out why. It made no sense to me, because everything I was being told within the group was that this is the best, most expansive, most wonderful thing ever. They kept me here in St. Paul to try to get the place going. And I was working with the staff members, and I was working with the public, and I came to find out that in the 5-state area here, in Minnesota and the states around here, there were about 120 Scientologists who are actively doing Scientology, which is a very different, like I literally knew every single one of them by name. I'd met them, I'd gone out to their door and, hi, come on, you know, come back in. And that was my job. And so I couldn't deny it anymore. It was undeniable. This was not what it was being presented to me, you know, as what it was. And there was a tremendous amount of stress on making money. Money, 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 money. So I went, you know, this isn't really what I signed up for. And in 2012, I stopped working for the church. Now, when I was here in Minnesota, I had to go back to LA to leave and do that whole process, divorce my wife, leave the whole thing, and I still believed that there was this method of achieving spiritual freedom through L. Ron Hubbard's techniques. I just thought the organization had somehow been corrupted or had been gone off the rails. So I went back to LA, did that, stopped working for the church, and I came back here because I had met someone here that I had fallen in love with and I wanted to be with. And, you know, what other reason would you have for moving to Minnesota? So, so I came back here. Yeah. And everybody knew me, you know, and I thought it was going to be great. Well, then the vindictive side of Scientology started making itself known to me. Because I had dared to leave the church, so to speak. I hadn't totally left. I still wanted to do the services. I was even willing to pay the money to do it. But I was creating bad PR, right? I was a bad image now for the church because I had been a dedicated staff member and Sea Org member, right? The most dedicated and hardcore of the hardcore. And then I had left, and I still wanted to do Scientology. Well, they didn't want me doing Scientology because they thought I was a bad image. And so when I arrived here in Minnesota, they said, you can't go into the church. You can't be on Facebook. Like, they wanted to control who I could be friends with on Facebook and who I could be in contact with. Well, that didn't go over so well. You know, a lot of you guys are just seeing me and meeting me for the first time. I'm a talkative guy. I like to interact with people. You know, I like to be social. So it got me wondering, okay, maybe there's something more about this that I don't know. And I got on the internet. Now, the whole time that I had been in the Sea Org, I did not have internet access. I didn't have my own phone because you couldn't have one. I didn't have a line to the outside world. I had never even heard of South Park. It was that bad. So, I didn't know really that Tom Cruise was considered a little crazy. We thought Tom Cruise was the bomb diggity man. We thought this guy was like, you know, practically L. Ron Hubbard incarnate, right? Tom Cruise could do no wrong. He was out there speaking the truth. He was out there like pounding the pavement for Scientology. So we just thought, you know, I had no idea how toxic the word Scientology was in the general world, because I had been living, and I came to discover that I had been living in a bubble world. I didn't know. No one in the little bubble worlds know that's what they're doing. They think that's reality, you know? And so I thought, I thought all kinds of nutty stuff. And when I got on the internet for real, and I started seeing what is said about Scientology, and then, more importantly, I started reading the testimonials and the stories of people who had been involved just like I had been. Even some people I knew who had left, and I didn't know that they had left because it wasn't generally talked about. You know, in the bubble world, bad news about the group is censored. It's kept off your lines, is what they call it in Scientology, right? It's off your plate. You don't want to talk about that. You don't want to have dinner conversations about who's left and what they're saying and stuff like that. All that is verboten. Any critical thinking about the organization, any complaining or, you know, maybe something here isn't on the up and up, that gets nipped in the bud right away. You literally get taken into a room and somebody sits down with you and you are told you are not to do that. So I hadn't been exposed to all this information that I was suddenly exposed to. I call it going down the rabbit hole, because for 3 months I just could not stop reading about all these things I had not known, because these things had been kept from me on purpose. So after 3 months, I found out that L. Ron Hubbard had been married 3 times to 2 women at the same time. Didn't know that. He had kids we didn't know about. I found out that his whole life story within that bubble world was a fantasy, and that the real story was very different. And it was not hard to disprove the lies once you saw, or once I saw his college transcripts that he'd flunked out of college. In the world of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard is the guy who attended the first class on atomic and molecular phenomena, right, in the early 1900s in college. He was one of the first. They have actually gone so far as to say in that bubble world that L. Ron Hubbard was one of the first atomic physicists, that he was a war hero. Well, I came to find out he never saw one day of combat, and in fact got kicked off of the command of the one ship that he ever got command of, because he bombed an island off the coast of Mexico, thinking he was sinking ships or something. I mean, it was that bad. It was like total incompetence. But he had rewritten his own history in the 1950s, way before there was an internet, way before anybody could fact check this stuff. And so his rewritten life story was what we had all bought into. The internet had been the only thing that had come along in the 2000s that had given us the ability to fact check his life story, and finding out that he had told a whole bunch of lies. Pretty bald-faced and bold lies, really. He was a little pathological about it. And I also found out about things that had gone on within the confines of that bubble world, within the confines of the church, that were actually really, really pretty criminal activity. Covering up pedophilia, covering up embezzlement, covering up suicides, that some Scientologists had committed suicide. That had been whitewashed. False stories made up about these things to tell Scientologists what had happened. And Tom Cruise, of course, jumping on Oprah's couch and acting like a general crazy person. Hadn't known about that. Then, of course, I learned about Xenu. Now, that whole story, by the way, within the bubble world, is something that you are told is sacred knowledge, which you have to be at this level. You can't find out about it here, because if you find out about it here, the consequence is that you'll die. That knowledge will kill you. All the way up to the point that I opened up the document and read it. And after I read it even, up to the next day, I was actually a little nervous in the back of my head. I got a little sick the next day, and I was like, oh shit. Like, that's how strong that indoctrination was. I took it seriously. You know, okay, I took Scientology seriously. You know, how many of us take whatever seriously, you know? We all buy into whatever beliefs we buy into. I don't have a problem with buying into beliefs. What I have a problem with is dictatorial control systems, and that's what I'm gonna go into now. I was forcibly separated from the woman that I moved out here to be with. I had asked her to marry me. Her family and I were getting to know each other. I mean, everything was really going really good. But once I started finding out about this stuff, me being the person that I am, I couldn't shut up about it. I had to say something. And so I got online, and I anonymously started posting on various chat boards and message boards for ex-Scientologists about my experiences. And I tried to do it in an anonymous way, so you know, I wouldn't be obvious who I was, but you know, you can only kind of keep up that sort of thing for so long. And I didn't really appreciate at the time how paranoid the Church of Scientology is. They actually have people whose job it is to monitor the internet and monitor those forums. And they go on there anonymously, and they pretend to be disgruntled former members. And they find out who the other disgruntled former members are. And they figured out who I was by some of the things that I was saying. And then they covertly, without me knowing about it even, started contacting every person that I know and telling them, Chris Shelton's bad news. You gotta stop talking to him because he's not with us anymore. He's only pretending to be. And this eventually led to my fiancée and her whole family, well, sorry, you're not with us, so you're against us. And that was rough. I tried to even make up with the church. I contacted them. I said, look, I don't want to be the final straw with them, the final point of no return is when they label you a suppressive person. That's the label. Suppressive means you push people down, you hold people down. You're basically an antisocial personality or a psychotic. On the same level as like a Hitler, a Napoleon, a Dillinger, this kind of thing. These are the comparisons L. Ron Hubbard makes when he calls somebody a suppressive person. So I didn't want that label, because I knew if that happened, it was going to be really the end. There would be no return. So I contacted them to try to make good and keep this relationship going, because I was totally madly in love with this woman. And I tried to cooperate with what they said to do. But they went ahead with the shunning or the disconnection process, and they all cut ties with me. And then at that point, I was kind of like, well, I've lost everything at this point. And having lost my faith in the belief, and then having lost in the real world the woman that I loved and the family that I wanted to be part of and all of that, and the whole reason I had even come to this part of the country, well, I didn't have anything else left to lose. So I started speaking out under my own name at that point. And then they officially labeled me a suppressive person, and I could no longer be in contact with, and no Scientologist could be in contact with me in any way. And when they do that, it doesn't matter whether the people who are, formally in touch with you are your family, your grandma, your kids, your friends, your compatriots, your business associates. All of them are forced to cut ties with you permanently. No Christmas cards, like nothing. And so I was totally cut off from people I had known for over 20 years, overnight. Facebook friends, crashed, and all the various consequences of that. So I didn't, like I said, I didn't really have anything left to lose, and I was pretty pissed. So I started speaking out under my own name about not just that process, because you kind of go, okay, well, that's rough, but you kind of knew that going in, that could be a consequence of what happens. All the lies that L. Ron Hubbard told, I did not know about. All the requirements, all the hoops I had to jump through all those years, I didn't know about that stuff until it was literally in my face. There's not a, what's the word? Informed consent, right? I didn't know going in all this stuff that was going to end up happening to me. And that's, that's why I speak out about this, is because I don't care if somebody wants to go do Scientology and believe in Xenu or not. I really could care less. But I do feel very strongly that they should definitely know what they're getting into before they do it. And that's the whole point of why I do what I do in being an activist against groups like Scientology. And I've come to learn over the last 4 years, after getting out of that group, that there are other groups like that. And then I came to learn that there's this thing called a cult. I was like, cults? What's that? I grew up in the 1980s when, the 700 Club talked about Satan and Dungeons and Dragons and, that sort of thing. That was my idea of a cult, right? People in robes and, knives and human sacrifices and stuff like that. Well, basically, exactly. I didn't have it clear in my head, well, what is a cult? What makes a group that? And so I've come to learn about that because I wanted to know more about it. Because a lot of people will call any group that they have a personal disagreement with a cult. But we can be a lot more specific than that. Don't be culty, right? Well, what does that mean exactly? Okay. A cult, by definition, is a system of religious veneration and devotion directed toward a particular figure or object. That's one definition. Another definition is a relatively small group of people having religious beliefs or practices regarded by others as strange or sinister. And another definition is a misplaced or excessive admiration for a particular person or thing. These are a little vague. It makes it very much dependent on your own point of view as to whether a group is a cult or not. And this word is actually, it's got an interesting history. I won't go into the history of it. I'll just say to you that it's interesting, and you can check it out. Because it was originally used back in the early 1920s when it started taking its modern definitions. It was used by fundamentalists. I mean, it actually got propagated by Christians. So instead of talking about cults, I actually clarify this or make it more specific, and I use the term destructive cult. Because a dangerous group, it's not made dangerous by its belief system. It's not what you believe. Xenu is not why Scientology is a destructive cult. A destructive cult has to do with a relationship between a leader figure and followers. You have to have a leader figure or figures, a leadership, and you have to have membership who believes in or follows that leader. And it doesn't even have to be religious in nature. A destructive cult can be a martial arts class, an acting class, a political group, as well as a religious group. We think about it in religious terms a lot, but if you got into some martial arts magazines, you'd be a little surprised, maybe, at how this is an acknowledged problem in the world of martial arts. So it isn't like, some strange dojo had a guy kind of go off the rails and start, dictating personal decisions for all of his students about how they should lead every aspect of their life. This happens a lot more frequently than people imagine. So I've come to describe this as an abusive relationship between a leadership and followers. And by abusive, I mean behavior that is cruel, inhumane, brutal, or even sadistic. A component of abuse is that it is unwanted or not agreed upon behavior, and that the treatment a person receives is harmful to them physically and or psychologically. We don't mean that it just makes a person feel uncomfortable or offended or argumentative. That's not abusive. Telling someone what you think about something is not abuse. That's just your First Amendment rights. Engaging in BDSM activity with another consenting adult is not an abusive relationship. You both are there on the same terms. You've agreed to what you're doing. On the other hand, engaging in a campaign of terror against a person by lying to their friends, family, and coworkers about them, now we're talking about abuse. Locking a person up in a closet or holding them against their will, that's abusive. And that's the kind of behavior that we're talking about when we talk about destructive cults. A destructive cult can exist between 2 people, or 2,000 people, or 2 million people. Size is not the determination. There are what we call narcissistic relationships, where a person has the unfortunate, finds themselves in a relationship with a malignant narcissist. And that person is abusing them verbally, maybe even physically. That is a destructive cult relationship, because that narcissist has power, undue influence, we call it, over their partner. It's the same dynamic on a bigger scale when you get into a group like Scientology. And the leadership, the rules and regulations of Scientology were written by L. Ron Hubbard. He died in 1986. But then another guy took over. His name is David Miscavige. And he's kind of worse in some ways, right? And he just follows L. Ron Hubbard's playbook. So this can, you can pass the torch in these cults. It's not just a one-generation thing. Although many, many, many of these groups do die off after their leadership does. So there was a group, I think, called the Family or something. That guy died, and then it all just sort of disappeared. So cults spring up and die off, and sometimes they take hold because they have a compelling belief system. But it's not the beliefs that make it a cult. Here are a couple of characteristics of what I'm talking about. If you're going to evaluate a group as to whether it's a destructive cult or not, there's actually a checklist. Sociologists and psychologists have done a lot of work on this. Actually, ever since the 1960s, when a guy named Robert Lifton did a study of survivors from Chinese re-education camps, we'll call them. When there was the communist uprisings in China, some Americans and French people and foreign people got caught up in that, and they got brainwashed, is what they were calling it back in the day. It's a very loose term that really doesn't mean a whole lot of anything, but they were trying to figure out what were these guys doing, because these people in China who got caught up in this got re-educated and then left China talking and praising China when they had been in this very abusive situation. So people were trying to figure out, why were these guys praising this horrible thing that they've been in? And studies started being done on this. And there's been a lot of psychological and sociological work done on it. A woman named Janja Lalich, who I've interviewed on my podcast, she's a really great woman, she put together a checklist, a sort of a Cult 101 checklist. How do you know if a group is got characteristics of being maybe not so great? Here are a couple of the characteristics. The group displays excessively zealous and unquestioning commitment to its leader, and whether he's alive or dead, regards his belief system, ideology, and practices as capital the truth. It is that way or the highway, so to speak. There's not a lot of room for individual thought. Questioning, doubt, and dissent are discouraged or even punished. The leadership dictates, sometimes in great detail, how members should think, act, and feel. For example, members must get permission to date, change jobs, marry, etc. When I was in the Sea Org, I had to get okay from my commanding officer before I could get married, for example. Leaders prescribe what types of clothes to wear, where to live, whether or not to have children, how to discipline children, etc. Another example is the group is elitist, claiming a special exalted status for itself, its leaders, and members. For example, the leader is considered the Messiah, or a special being, or an avatar, or the group or the leaders are on a special mission to save humanity. And one other characteristic that's actually pretty important is the group has a polarized us versus them mentality, which may cause conflict with the wider society, right? There's nothing wrong with feeling like you're part of a special group, but when your group, whether it's the Boy Scouts or the Hare Krishnas or Scientologists, when your group are the only people who matter, and everyone else in the world are degraded, lesser people because they're not part of your group, you could see how there might be some problems created with that. So there are a couple different models. I'm going to just go through a couple other characteristics real fast, and then we'll get to the Q&A. Because I've been talking, and I want you guys to talk too. Janja Lalich again. There's different sociologists and psychologists put together different models to talk about how these groups behave. There's a guy named Steve Hassan who put together what's called the BITE model. And that is BITE, right? Behavior, information, thought, and emotion control. If a group engages in activity that could be considered BITE control, then you might have a destructive cult there. Every single group that gets analyzed on this has to be individually looked at. You can't just look at a group and go, oh, they have a strong belief system, they're a cult. It doesn't, it's a lot more nuanced than that. Janja Lalich put together what's called a bounded choice model. Your choices are bound or boxed in, okay? You have charismatic authority figure. You have a transcendent belief system. And an interesting example of this was Enron. You guys remember Enron, that business? They fit this model. And they were a company. Because inside Enron, a lot of people don't know this, but within Enron, they thought they had the business model to top every other business model ever. And if you didn't agree, you found yourself on the street pretty damn fast. It actually was a company as a destructive cult. And they believed their transcendent belief system was that they were going to bring their business model to every business in the world. You have a system of control, or various systems of control in place, and you have various systems of influence in place. And the last thing I want to mention on that is that there is one way you can sort of think about this on a very personal level for yourself in terms of the groups you belong to or are part of, or when you look at other groups that other people you know are part of. Influence could be considered a spectrum, right? This chair has absolutely no influence over me whatsoever, right? I'm not bothered by this chair. It doesn't have any control or power over me. My mom, she's got a lot of influence over me, right? When my mom says to do stuff, yeah, okay, I'll do it. So it's a spectrum. You see what I'm talking about? And you could consider that there's a green and maybe a white and then a red zone of influence. And if somebody has so much influence over you that you don't feel that you have the ability to question or ask or say no or think differently than how that influence is being put over you, you might be a little too far down that spectrum of influence. So it's just a way of thinking about it. So some of these problems may have developed in groups you guys have been part of, and or will be in the future. So I wanted to just briefly say, kind of following along the lines of a seminar that was given yesterday. Actually, there was a whole leadership seminar given. It was really good. And if you join a group, any size, are there guidelines, are there rights, are there rules in place to protect you and protect the other people who are in the group and protect the leadership as well? If there aren't, if it's all just kind of loosey-goosey, well, that might be great when everything is running smooth and everything's fine and everybody's getting along. But the second there's a conflict or a problem or a disagreement of some kind, either whether it's with the leadership or between the members, are there structures in place to deal with that in a rational way? And does everybody understand what those guidelines and rules are? If not, you're asking for trouble. Trust me, I know. Yeah, basically a couple pieces of advice really that I have for you after telling you this whole story about this awful thing that I went through. Just don't become a member of a group assuming anything about how the group operates or what it will do in the face of adversity or conflict. And know what the requirements are, know what's expected of you beforehand, not when it's happening. Because in the heat of the moment, when the pressure's kind of there, either a social pressure or a leadership pressure, or even internal pressure from yourself, oh, well, I really want this. That's not the time to be questioning, should I, shouldn't I? You kind of want to lay this stuff out beforehand. To the degree that a group is secretive or it's not willing to tell its membership about itself or its practices is the degree that there could be real trouble later on. Which is not to say that you have to be exposed to all the potential knowledge you would get in the group beforehand. I'm not saying that. There are levels to groups. There are layers to them. You're not going to get full disclosure about all the, whatever knowledge base might be there on day one. But you should get full disclosure on what your rights are as a group member and what's expected of you. There shouldn't be any gotchas on that. You don't want to find out 6 months in or a year in that you're supposed to have sex with the leader in order to get to the next level. I mean, you kind of want to know that before you commit to being involved in something for a year. Kind of what I'm talking about here, right? Just to give a real practical example. In some groups, I have been told and have seen over the last couple years that I've been doing all this research on this stuff, there have not been methods of recourse or formal justice procedures for victims. Leaders have put unrealistic or capricious demands or compromising requirements on members in order for them to advance, and there was nothing that the members thought they could do, and so they felt helpless or conflicted, and they got stuck. And it got ugly, and it got a little weird, and it got really uncomfortable, and sometimes there could be social blow-ups as a result of that. So all of the things I'm talking about here are really just, know before you go, okay? That's a pretty good mantra. Accountability is a key word on this. Is there a system of accountability within the group that you're looking at becoming part of? And if there's not, can there be one put in place? And if not, thanks, but no thanks. That's kind of some advice for you on that. Does all that make sense? Okay. Well, that's kind of what I had to say. There's all kinds of minutia and details to how I got more and more involved in Scientology, eventually sprung out of it. Other people did. I'm happy to answer any questions about any of that. So let's go ahead and do some Q&A. Yes? Okay, so I'll repeat the question since I'm recording this. You're asking what it would take to kind of bust up Scientology? Here's the thing, and it's a rough thing. It kind of sucks that it's this way. Every person joins a destructive cult for their own individual reasons. There isn't a broad, I'm gonna lay this fact on you, and it's gonna blow your mind, and you're gonna be out. I only wish it was that easy. No one joins a cult. No one. No one just, I'm going to wake up today, I'm going to go join a cult, right? I'm going to spend the next 10 years of my life in an abusive relationship. Hell yeah, right? No one does that, right? It's a gradual process, a small series of agreements, one after another, that get you in to the point where you're in so deep, you don't know how to get out. Critical thinking is my mantra. If there's anything that's going to bust up Scientology or any of these groups, it's getting people to think critically. It's hard. It's not natural to us. We're emotional-based way more than we're logic-based. Just kind of how we are. We're animals that way. And we like things that make us feel good. And there's even theories in psychology and neurology that our whole rational mind was evolved to rationalize why we feel the way we feel about something, as opposed to the other way around, you see. Like the rationalization came after the fact of how you feel about a thing, whether you like it or dislike it. And I see that over and over again, right, in politics and sports and everything. So, it's when I address a Scientologist who maybe is on the fence, or a family member or a friend who's writing to me for advice about how to deal with a family or friend, the advice is always get them talking about it. See where they're at. Because I can tell you, if you're a Scientologist, what I think is wrong about it all day long. But the thing you think might be wrong with it might have nothing to do with what I experienced. So it's a lot of listening more than talking. Yeah. So you're asking about my legal situation with Scientology, and I have been fortunate. The timing with which my coming out of the church was in 2012, 2013. I followed or was concurrent with the Going Clear documentary. Leah's show came out. I got to be on Leah's show. That was a lot of fun. She's amazing. How you see her on the show, by the way, that's her. That is exactly what she's like. So I sort of fell between the cracks a little bit, because what's happening now, and really ever since 2008, when a group called Anonymous with a bunch of masks started protesting Scientology internationally, thousands of them at once, Scientology didn't know how to deal with that. They had no clue. Scientology has policies to sue a person into the ground, to ruin them utterly, is what L. Ron Hubbard actually specifically said. And they followed those policies. But after Anonymous happened, their legal teeth sort of got blunted. And so now there's another trick to this also, which is that the leader of Scientology is a guy named David Miscavige. Well, if Scientology sues me, there's a process in court. It's called discovery. They have to give information. I have to give information. Scientology has gotten to a point, and David Miscavige has gotten to a point where he is terrified of ending up in a courtroom because he's got skeletons in his closet.
Literally.
Yeah, that's right. So they're not so eager to sue anymore. They don't have that. They have the resources to do it, and honestly speaking, they could ruin my life. But they lost the will to do that, is kind of really what happened. Yeah, in terms of the fair gaming you're asking about, where you could have personal harassment, I actually prepared my life for that before I started speaking out, because I expected it to happen. And to this day, if I flew home right now, because I live in Denver, and there were people on my doorstep camped out with signs, talking about what a horrible person Chris Shelton is, I wouldn't be surprised. And I'm prepared for it. All my friends, I work for myself now. When I first started doing this, I worked for some people out here in Minnesota. I told them what I was doing. I said, this might happen. And they said, bring it. I was like, yes. They were great. And they were very helpful to me in my transition out of that experience. So I lucked out in a number of ways. I have been, and I will say, I'm the first to admit it, I have been extremely lucky in a number of ways as a Scientology, ex-Scientology activist. In terms of physical danger or threat, I'm not really overly concerned. However, it is an interesting life I lead, in that I have to take care with the people who get into my inner circle. I do have to have my guard up all the time. I just do. It's a necessary and unfortunate fact that Scientology is a destructive cult that does try to ruin people's lives. And so that could happen to me. There could be people I know right now who are actually Scientologists in hiding, who are connected to me on Facebook or in my personal life. But I've got a pretty good vetting process. And I have a lot of friends who have never, ever had anything to do with Scientology. And I found, love again. I've got a fiance who now I'm going to be marrying in May. Never knew anything about Scientology until I came along. And I made sure of that with her family and stuff. So, so I have to take measures, but it's not like I'm, Edward Snowden or something. It's not quite that bad. Yeah, the question being about cults and how frustrating is that for me. People are people. They get together in groups and they do silly things. I try to keep a sort of a, okay, sort of attitude about it, rather than get all like uptight and, don't you people understand, I try not to really go there too often. Sometimes it gets a little frustrating with some of the more extremist groups, especially when the beliefs are really wacko. But I keep in mind, and in fact that's why I stress that it's not the beliefs. It doesn't have anything to do with that, you know. I don't know, really what it comes down to is I've learned a lot about science, and I've learned a lot about sociology over the last few years. I'm probably going to be pursuing a degree in psychology at some point in the next couple of years. And I try really hard to keep the viewpoint of an educator, you know, because I think people can be educated out of that kind of a situation more often than not. Sometimes not, but that's what I try to do. Right, yeah, why do people act that way as far as cult leadership goes? It's not a question that has an easy answer or even a definite answer or even a single answer. L. Ron Hubbard, for example, probably suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy. And that was something that was undiagnosable until he died. I mean, they didn't even know how to diagnose it until the 80s. He died in 86. Turns out there might have been some other famous people in history who suffered from that. We can only kind of guess from the symptomology. There is a lot of work still to be done in neurology and psychology and sociology to get hard answers on that. It could be genetic, it could be cultural, it could be combinations of these things. What we know is that there is a small percentage of the population who have urges or desires to control other people. And their pleasure is other people's pain. You could look at it as an aberration, I do. But I know I don't know enough about it yet to give a definite answer on it other than to say there's a certain percentage of people who just get off on hurting other people or having control over other people. It's unfortunate. It's alien to a lot of people's way of thinking, which is why we struggle to, like, you know, because our ability to understand other people is kind of limited to the degree that of our own understanding of things. And so we try to put ourselves in their shoes and have the empathy and compassion to understand why are they coming from. But it's hard to understand somebody who doesn't experience empathy and doesn't experience compassion. And yet there are a certain percentage of people who don't. The Sociopath Next Door is a book that talks about this. There's been, again, a lot of studies on this and a lot more to go. Unfortunately, mental health is one of the social sciences that is the farthest behind in terms of our ability to understand ourselves and why we are the way we are. Brain science and social sciences are working very hard on that problem, and there's some answers, but not enough. Yes, I am hopeful that that will be the case. For now, from a sociological perspective, we do have the characteristics or ability to look at a group and how that group operates and establish how that leader and follower relationship goes, and we can make judgments based on that. And we can go, right? That much we've gotten. Why that leader is that way, not so much yet. Yeah, so does Scientology discourage higher education? Yes. L. Ron Hubbard was the founder and the leader of Scientology, and he badmouthed college left, right, and center. And so we did too. Like, I had been going to college when I was recruited to start up for staff in Santa Barbara. I'd been graduated high school, I was in college for 3 weeks. And I was a little bit like, wow, it was community college. I was a little like high school, the sequel. I don't really like this very much. So it wasn't hard to get me out of that. But they just had to show me a couple quotes. There are many, many, many quotes from L. Ron Hubbard's lectures and works that are compiled into recruitment packs, right? His inspirational quotes, his quotes about how the society is degrading and is not worth investing in, and how we need to rebuild society from scratch, right? We need to rebuild the world because it's going to hell in a handbasket and there's nothing that can be done about it. These kind of quotes were put together, and I used to use those to recruit people or recover them into the church. So there is no higher education available in Scientology or the Sea Org. There is only the education of L. Ron Hubbard and the materials he provides, right? This is how life is, this is how it works, and these are the rules to and the guideline to become a immortal spiritual being. And that's all that matters, and everything else is secondhand news, old school, and we don't care about it. That's kind of the attitude about it. Yeah, you're asking about relationships to people, like in a narcissistic relationship versus, say, a 2,000-size destructive cult. There's a whole lot of them, actually. I've done whole podcasts on this topic with licensed therapists who are, schooled in narcissism. It really comes down to how much power of choice do you have in the relationship? How do you feel around the person? How does that person make you feel in private versus in public? Because they can often seem like two different people. In a public sphere, a narcissist can be the life of the party. Everybody loves the guy or girl, right? Nobody would ever suspect. You get home, they're belittling, they're condescending, they're insulting, they're controlling, overbearing. So that is an indicator that maybe something's amiss in this relationship. There's a thing called gaslighting, where you see something, you call it out, and the person says, I didn't do that. I didn't say that. You're imagining things. And you're like, no, it just happened. You just said that. No, I didn't. It's all, if it was on video, you'd be aghast. You'd be, how could this person possibly be denying what they just said or did? And yet, that's what happens in private, right? It's called gaslighting because it was based on a movie called Gaslight, where that happens, where a man basically tortures his wife and tries to drive her insane. You start feeling in a narcissistic relationship like you're going a little nuts. It can get to that point because of the constant gaslighting. So those are kind of some of the indicators of it. There's a lot more, of course, but it's a little bit of what I can give you. As far as where I'm at?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, spiritually.
Where you are in relationship, pagan stuff.
Just to be really simple in my answer, I would label myself, the most accurate label I have for myself is agnostic. I call myself an atheist because it prevents arguments. Sometimes, yeah. I have pretty much rejected the idea of organized religion for a number of reasons, although I see its benefits on a historical level. I get the big picture of religion, and I'm not like, destroy all religion, but it's not really for me at this point. I have what I call spiritual hopes, not spiritual beliefs, because they're not strong enough to be beliefs. Okay? And that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I am constantly and always receiving new information and reevaluating my judgments and experiences based on the new information I receive. And that is what I consider to be critical thinking. So that's how I try to approach things. Last question. Okay, so key things to look for in smaller or more fluid groups would be overbearing control factors of belief or behavior, a demanding leadership, my way or the highway sort of thinking. One thing that I have noted in the pagan community that I've associated with so far, here and other times, is the openness of it. And that has more than anything has sort of shown me that this is not just a bunch of little destructive cults, right? Which is really good. Yeah, you do. So, because you guys sort of, to paint with a broad brush here, sort of the exact opposite of what I was when I was a Scientologist. I was a capital T, capital B, true believer, right? I was very strong in my beliefs, and I was just as strong that you should believe just as strong as I do. So, oh, very much so. Actually, it's funny you mention that, because one of the policies that L. Ron Hubbard wrote for Scientologists was called jokers and degraders. And he said, if you are a person who is making a bunch of jokes about this subject and you think that it's fun to degrade what we're doing, you're psychotic.
You should be a pagan.
Yeah, that's what he said. And having a sense of humor in Scientology is sometimes appreciated when it comes to ridiculing psychiatry or groups that are anti-Scientology. But on the subject of Scientology itself, there is to be no joking about this. They take themselves very seriously. And in fact, another thing L. Ron Hubbard wrote is that Scientology is a deadly serious activity, right? Win or die in the attempt. Those are the words that he used. So they take themselves very seriously.
Do you want to tell us about that book?
I was going to get to that. Okay, so just shameless plug. I wrote this book. It's all about Scientology. It is not a memoir. This book is about the subject of Scientology. It's a critical analysis of it. I wanted to do something different than just talk about how I was a victim of Scientology. So instead, I took it and I broke down who was L. Ron Hubbard, what is Scientology, what is the belief system, and why is it ridiculous? Not Xenu ridiculous, but why is it destructive? Why does it actually hurt people to be part of it? That's what this book is about. And also, the last 3 chapters of the book are about recovery from a destructive cult group. And I think that I'm not a licensed therapist yet, but I think the advice that I give could be pretty universal for anybody who's looking to recover from an abusive relationship of any kind, whether it was a cult group or a one-on-one.
So, if I wanted to buy one of those?
You could buy it from me right now. It is $20 straight up. I do not have a credit card scanner, but you can PayPal me or write me a check or give me money or whatever. And I will. I'd be happy to. And that is the end of our talk. Thank you very much, guys.